Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack. We trace the witch trials of the past alongside the sorcery accusations still claiming lives today. There is a question the history books can't answer for us. Once the harm of witch hunting is acknowledged, what does repair actually look like?
Today we speak with Claire Standen, a trauma resolution practitioner and the founder of a project called Reclamation, which is developing alongside the several Scottish grassroots witch trial advocacy campaigns and is focused on reparations for the thousands of Scots, most of them women, prosecuted and executed under the historic Scottish Witchcraft Act.
What if the Church of Scotland, who has given an official apology, also gifted a church building, not sold, not grant funded, but returned to women, an unused church building to become a community space? It could be the Center for Female Authority, a place of healing and pride.
If this instinct sounds familiar to longtime listeners, it should. Since Connecticut's institutions aren't making room to remember the full story of witch hunting in Connecticut, the grassroots collaboration Connecticut Witch Trial Exoneration Project has built that room ourselves through absolution legislation, public remembrance gatherings, expert-driven podcasting, and with local pop-up education and memorial booths.
Claire is doing something kindred in Scotland, following what's felt rather than what's permitted. Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts, Claire Standen. We're so glad to have you here to talk about Reclamation. Before we get into the campaign, please tell us what we need to know about you.
Well, I'm a single mother, but it's important actually. And I live in Scotland. I've lived in Scotland my entire adult life, though I wasn't born here. I was born in England. And I've had a kind of circuitous career. So my original training was in ecological science, and I went into the forestry industry and worked there for a little while. And then I sort of followed a calling to become a veterinary nurse. And I did that for enough years, essentially until I became a single mother, and it was not really fitting in with being able to be on call and that kind of thing. And I embarked upon retraining and running my own business. So some of the things useful to know about me is like I have training in neuro-linguistic programming. That's probably like the main body of my training, as well as hypnotherapy. So I don't necessarily pull those two things apart because for me, they're integrated into the work that I do. I'm also a breathwork teacher, and I have a number of other kind of modalities that I use, a lot of which are very focused on trauma resolution in a variety of different ways. That's probably the most of what we need to know just now.
Thank you so much. Can you please ground our listeners in an overview of what you're setting out to do with the Reclamation campaign?
Yes, absolutely. Reclamation is going to be an organisation. We're setting it up as a Scottish community interest organisation. And it came about from the campaign to get reparations for the witch trials here in Scotland, which happened between the 1500s and the 1700s. So having said that, reclamation is actually becoming a much bigger thing. It seems to be reaching a lot of people and speaking to them in a variety of different ways. So what I would love people to know about this is that what we're attempting to do is to really meet something that happened in the past that we don't feel has been put right, and that we also feel has had an enormous impact on the lives of not just women, but everybody really, in the way that impacting women's lives through what is essentially, I believe, fear, and I would almost go so far as to say terror, has an impact on everybody in society. So as we work to get reparations, what we intend to do is to start to turn that around so that women's authority starts to be something that is once again, because this wouldn't be the first time in history, but that is once again revered and held up as restorative, sustainable, and reparative in society.
You shared a little bit about yourself and expertise. How have those things come together to set the stage for this project?
This is a hard question to answer because, in a way, I don't really know what the thread is because it's more in front of me than it is behind. So as I move through this project and this campaign, I'm finding a lot of synchronicities and things that start to make sense as I discover them. For sure, there is something about the fact that I've been working with humans at a really relational human level for a decade, or nearly a decade, understanding the subtle and sometimes very overt, extremely deeply rooted impacts of traumatic events. I had the very great privilege to work with veterans for a time here in the UK. And these were people, primarily men in this case, and some women, who had been impacted by extremely traumatic events that were having an impact on how they were showing up in their everyday life. So I have this deep understanding that when we look at humans, how they show up is always making sense when we can understand the history and the impacts of what's happened. And in large part, they're meaning making about that. But we're also talking about the epigenetics of trauma, things that happened to ancestors that speak through our bodies in ways we don't necessarily understand yet. And that science is only just starting to be able to understand. So as I come to this body of work, and I've been looking at the very individualistic level, also how those individuals operate in organizations, in society, in community. But what we're looking at here is if we really zoom out and we look at this whole country, I believe that through this lens, we could start to understand an awful lot about what is going wrong. And an awful lot is going wrong.
I and probably Josh and the other members of our projects that have evolved and grown over the last 4 years can really identify when you say there's more ahead of you than behind you. Our history, our individual business experiences, life experiences, what's meaningful to us about our own heritage really feeds into the work we do. So I really identify with that. And also the synchronicity of things were very critical for us to be able to get the first project moving forward, which was the exoneration of the accused witches of Connecticut. So I really identify with what you're saying, even though they're very different contexts and cultures, and goals fuels the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Now, in our communication, you mentioned that the idea to ask a church for property arrived through something close to a magical story. Can you tell us that story and take us to the moment that you knew this was the form the work would take?
I would love to tell you that story. As I sit here today, I'm 42. And to go back to the beginning of this story, as I see it just now, we need to go back to my 40th birthday. I was child-free, which is no mean feat for a single mum. And I decided, or rather, it seemed to me it was a good idea to take a journey. And I didn't really know where. And since I didn't have anybody else to drag along with me, it really didn't matter. So I thought, well, I'm just going to pack the car. And I had a roof tent And there is a beautiful little bookshop just opposite me in the town that I live in. So I walked across the road. I asked for recommendations. They stacked up some books of the witchy genre, and I picked a couple and set off on my way. And as I drove north, because that is where my heart told me to go, and it's been a number of years since I've been doing this kind of embodiment work, mind-body connection stuff, that I've learnt never to betray my heart. And so as I drove north, I was reading one of the books, and it was actually a bit rubbish. So I decided that probably life was a bit short to read a rubbish book. And I picked up the second, and it was a book called The Last Witch of Scotland by an author called Philip Parris. And it is fictional, but it's based on the facts that we know about the last witch to be executed in Scotland under the Witchcraft Act. And I was reading it, and as I would stop and camp for the night and read a chapter or two, I started to realize that I was actually in the area that the story was taking place. And not only was I in the area, but I would be in the specific places of that chapter. So I would camp up beside the River Brora in this lovely little camping spot, and the daughter of the last witch would be escaping round the periphery of Lake or Loch Brora. And something was activating in my body. At the time, it was pure shock of the synchronicity, and I really couldn't make sense of it. But as I look back now, I begin to think what was perhaps activating was a felt sense of how small this community was, how terrifying it would have been to have everybody's eyes on you, everybody looking for you, knowing whereabouts you were, to be escaping across that wild landscape. And in all honesty, that happened. I returned home, sat with it, and left it. I didn't know what to do with it. And 2 years passed, and they were personally, at a really personal level, pretty hard years. It just brought up a lot of things for me to work through in a way that I thought perhaps as a trauma resolution therapist for, up to about 8 years, then I maybe was over that. But I did have a couple of pretty hard years. And at the beginning of this year, 2026, in January, I really made this commitment to myself that there must be more to life than what 2025 looked like. I looked through my diary and I realized I had barely been anywhere, barely had any conversations, barely spent any time with anyone, and not really done anything of any note. And I did some intention setting for my life, some ritual, really, to all intents and purposes, to say there's some things I want to do. It's not specific doings. It's more a way of being that I intend to lean into. And I would say that probably that decision opened up some kind of conduit to this idea dropping in about the reparations. I was engaged in a competition, and I was asked to make an ask of somebody for something that I thought they would probably say no to. And because of the way that the competition was set up, it really asked you to dig into your desires first, and then really amp them up, and then make this audacious ask. And as I ramped up, I realized I would like my work to be done from a church, actually. That feels right to me. And so a shortcut to getting a church, it seemed to me, was to ask the church, could I have one of these churches that you have available? And not only could I have it, but I think you should give it to me as reparations for what the church did to primarily women in Scotland under the Witchcraft Act. So that's how I got to be here.
So you expressed what it was like for you to read this story of a specific victim and finding yourself in her environment and its impact. As you've maybe looked at the history story, like from a historical standpoint, has there been anything that surprised you or stood out to you as like a follow-up to having met that environment and that person?
So I think the thing that has surprised me the most about the history of witchcraft trials in Scotland is, as you two have mentioned, you're direct descendants of women hanged as witches. In Scotland, it's much more likely that we will be descended from people who persecuted witches, and maybe that's also true where you are, but that's the narrative that people have here, is that we are not connected to those people who are primarily women, and that we don't feel that connection, or that I'm told that, we're not really supposed to feel that connection. And that's really surprising to me because of this embodied experience that I had of feeling the connection.
Among the people that were accused, the very ordinary people, your neighbors and people you'd work with, were healers and midwives that communities depended on. Why was reclaiming the word witch and those women the foundation you wanted to build on?
So the women that were accused would have been a variety of different things. So far as I understand, it would have been that they, yes, could have been healers or midwives. They also could have been women who didn't have a significant male other and were kind of vulnerable in that way. It could have been that they had a certain amount of power because of owning property. It could have been that they dissented in some way, used their voice to speak out about something that was wrong in the community. And it feels to me that that legacy lives on. I don't think it just lives on in Scotland. I think one of the reasons that this project speaks to a lot of women is that I believe that legacy lives on as a cultural and societal, also political and institutional. It lives on at a broad scale in a great variety of different ways. And those women that you talked about in your question stand as kind of talismans for what we're looking at here today still. And they also, for me, it feels like were easy targets. And I personally don't want to continue to exist in the world that looks like a place where we pick on easy targets. And by way of picking on easy targets, we gain control over groups of people and what they believe is possible for them, available to them.
Your comment on the connection really lands hard with me because our whole place here in the United States as a nonprofit, that doesn't quite make sense to a lot of people. The name, they're not aware that witchcraft accusations could have happened outside Salem before or after now. And then also, as we have made efforts to find a place for the Connecticut portion of the history to be learned about, there's no exhibit, there's no group memorial. There is that missing connection. The modern community doesn't feel that heritage, that connection. So I really identify with that too. And I think reclaiming these victims is as broad as you're saying. In 2022, there was apologies and acknowledgement that came from the Scottish government and the church. I'd love to hear if you knew about that or when you became aware of it and how that affected you, but also why does the church have your attention for this project? And does the government owe anything?
Yes, the work to get a formal apology was done by a group called the Witches of Scotland, two women called Claire and Zoe. And they did this amazing body of work, and they're continuing a body of work to try and get a memorial as well for the witches. And they got an apology. Now, there was a theological body of work that came with that apology from a professor from the University of Glasgow. In it, he talked about meaningful apology, what meaningful apology is. And he used a metaphor of somebody stealing a car and apologizing for stealing the car, but not making any moves to give the car back, continuing to drive the car around. And there was something about that to me, as I dug into it, started to feel really pertinent about the idea of reparations versus the idea of an apology. A meaningful apology, it has certain parts to it. And then reparations goes beyond that. You think you can tell from the story so far that reason is not a huge part of the way that I'm approaching this campaign. Instead, I'm following what is felt. And what is felt for me is that not only is the church continuing to drive the car, but they also have made it very difficult for women to learn to drive, to own a car. And it almost feels a bit like they scared women out of driving. And by driving, I really mean tapping into their own faith in their own way and being able to follow what feels true for them rather than what is indoctrined by the church. As to the government and their apology, which came alongside the church's apology, I don't know yet where this campaign will lead. We're starting where we're starting, and that's not to say that there might not be other additional campaigns or other parts of this that will address that as well. I guess one of the difficulties in terms of the government is that government changes every 4 years, and the Church of Scotland is the institution that has remained constant as the Church of Scotland throughout that time.
And one thing that you're making clear with your project is that the harm didn't end with the executions. The women who survived learned to stay quiet, and they passed down caution to their daughters. How does your work try to undo that inherited silence?
So this speaks to some of the work that I've done in terms of trauma resolution. And we have an increasing body of knowledge in the scientific community and in the healing community more generally that harm that is done in one generation moves through the next generation. They've studied this in animals, for example. There's this really interesting study in which they took a group of mice and they exposed them to electric shocks at the same time as a particular scent. And they let those mice have offspring and then studied the offspring's reaction to that particular scent. Now, it makes a whole load of sense that the first generation would exhibit fear when they smell that scent that has been associated in their lifetime, in their body, in their experience with an unpleasant experience. But as we look at it on the surface, it makes absolutely no sense that their progeny would experience a fear response around that scent. If we think about the kind of biological processes, psychological process, everything about that outcome, it is mind-blowing. And when we look at that's a very kind of distinct event, one thing, and that can be studied. But when we think about all of the things that happened across time in a sustained campaign against certain women and some men, and we look at what would have lived on through generations epigenetically and biologically, it seems to me so abundantly obvious that that has an impact in today's society and how we currently operate.
We talked a little bit about the first stage, the admission of wrongdoing. And do you feel that the acknowledgement of harm has been fully addressed? And there's also this reparative action that is missing. These are 3 obligations that you talk about that are part of a meaningful apology. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah. So for me personally, I don't believe that when the church apologized for past wrongdoings, that there was a true acknowledgement of harm linked to what we were just speaking about in terms of what that might mean today. I have been having a lot of conversations on this topic. And one of the things that people will tend to say is there are women who are ministers in the church. So you can't make this argument that women's faith was interrupted or women's authority was interrupted because they've put that right and there are women holding the title of minister in the church. For me, that argument means that there is not a true acknowledgement of harm. It undermines what is felt for an awful lot of people. And it is an awful lot of people. Already, as I speak to people across continents, there is something about this movement and this campaign that speaks to something that people haven't quite been able to put their finger on. It broadly, in the kind of context of what's alive for people right now, people are interested in what does a matriarchal society look like? How did we lose that? How come things are so overtly bad and harmful right now? People are feeling that rupture in healthy ways of being and healthy ways of relating and being in community. And I think that speaks to what we're talking about. And without acknowledging that this was a big part of that, there's not that real acknowledgement. And then there's actually this body of work, and it was by a Durham University student, C. Simpson, who talked about meaningful apology. And it was actually in the context of war crimes. But I think it has some elements that are really interesting for us in this. it has those three parts, but then it also has, is the apology in the correct form? Is it done by the appropriate actor? Does it take collective responsibility? Is there commitment to restoring the relationship? Is there a ceremonial aspect, which I think is really beautiful in this context to be asking that question? And then the final one is like, what is the act that supports the apology? That's what we're sitting in here, is who gets to decide whether an apology was meaningful? I literally had a conversation with my children this morning, who are 12 and 9, about this very thing, because it's abundantly clear to me at a mothering level that when one person apologizes but they don't really mean it, or they apologize but in bad faith, the other person feels that. And actually, a much more relationally healthy way to look at this would be through the either reparative or restorative justice lens, which is where we take the person who has been harmed, elevate them to a place of authority, and we say, what do you need to heal? Because what you need to heal heals us all.
Is reclaiming the church itself the reparation, or does it matter that the money for it comes from public funds, the way the Scottish Land Fund helped buy a church in Aberdeen?
Yes, there are a variety of different ways in which community groups can raise funds to procure churches. It matters to me that no money changes hands in this transaction, including what essentially, if the Scottish Land Fund were to offer up the grant to get this church, what we would have would be a situation in which the state were providing the church with a lot of money on our behalf as a group in order for us to get stewardship of the church. The campaign is for the church to gift a physical church for us to use as headquarters for Reclamation, which will be the charity, for future campaigns that we may run, but also for the very deep and far-reaching work that we intend to do, putting right some of the societal wrongs that exist in part, because of what happened.
I wanted to just bring up our experience over here a little bit when we talk about reparations. In the American history, the most that was offered was a little restitution to a few of the Salem families, as far as we know, as far as records reveal. And it was pretty immediate after the trials. In Connecticut and Massachusetts, we've had legislation go through to acknowledge the wrong, to declare them innocent. But to get the project rolling, to get the resolution proposed and accepted and on the docket for review from the judicial committees, we had to promise not to seek reparations from the government. And what you're doing here is building a path that definitely doesn't exist here. So I'm wondering, is this really a big ask, or is this feel so big because we're taught not to expect repair?
That's a beautiful question. It really speaks to the journey I've taken with this, which is I did not think it was a big ask. I did not. I thought it was actually a fairly modest ask, given what I was speaking to with the ask and the persecution of 4,000 plus and execution of 2,500 plus people who were primarily women. seems, though, that we have learnt not to ask for anything very much. When you spoke about this agreement not to seek reparations, for me, there is a real alignment with the way that divorce works in the world. A lot of people, when they sign divorce papers, it's like, well, I promise I won't come after your pension. I promise I won't ask for anything more moving forwards. And I find that very interesting as a setup. And I actually think when we're talking about these issues, part of the reason I want to do the work at the scale that I want to do it is because so often in these situations, what we're doing is we're working with a set of rules and assumptions and laws, legislation that has been born of a patriarchal model of society in which you legally sign something, you are not allowed to ask for any more, and that's the end of it. What I feel is happening there is that there's this whole level of organizational stuff that holds these things in place, not just in this one very specific situation, but in a whole variety of different things across the whole of society. And they're held in place like that. I think we're increasingly beginning to see that although the narrative has been that it works, more or less, it seems very clear to me that this isn't really working for anybody. And I think what needs to happen is that we start to understand that some of this stuff in the middle needs to fundamentally change, that it was born of something that had a whole load of assumptions and difficulties within it. And actually, we need to start having conversations above that. And I'm not just talking about church reparations. I'm talking about educational reform and healthcare reform and just a whole tranche of different things that we need to be having deeper conversations about how these things work. Because otherwise, the sorts of agreements that get made hold a whole load of very unjust things in place for the majority of people.
Does the Church of Scotland have many properties that are unused or little used that are available?
Yes, Church of Scotland, and I believe other church organisations, are experiencing and are having a lot of conversations about diminishing numbers of people coming into their congregations. And as a result of this, they are examining what is a very costly set of buildings that they currently own, most of which are very old and in need of repair, costly to run. Part of what they are doing at the moment is offloading a lot of buildings that fall into that category.
And is there significance to you that it would be reclaiming some sacred space versus just money to go build and fund such a project?
It's significant that it's a church because the church has historically offered up such a patriarchal model of faith and worship, whereby you are preached to by somebody who is considered to be closer to God or deeper in their faith than you are. What this project represents is a reclamation of the idea that we each have our own connection to faith, if that's what we call it, to the divine, if that's what we call it, and that we really deserve to follow that from a place that's in true integrity, and to do that in community in a space that represents something that oppressed that, suppressed it, and persecuted women for it.
You've called this future organization, this location, a center for female authority. Why the word authority? What does that mean to you? What would things look like at this facility?
Thank you for that question. One reflection I've had from people when they hear this name, a Centre for Female Authority, is that they really love that it's not called the Centre for Female Authority, that it's called a Centre for Female Authority. What we have building behind this organisation and this centre is really an awful lot of experts and women who have worked very hard to get to the top of their field and to overcome some of the situations that hold women back to this day. And they feel very deeply that there are different ways for us to operate and to do things in the world. And not only that there are, but that it's becoming increasingly imperative that we explore them. So what I want this centre to be is really a beacon. I want it to be the first, but not the only. And the kinds of things that I see happening in the church, one thing that keeps returning to me as an idea is I can see, for example, all of the heads of women's charities in Scotland and perhaps the UK and perhaps internationally coming together to talk about how funding works for women's work and to bring it into this, what I said earlier, instead of everybody fighting for little pots of money, burning themselves out trying to fund work that's imperative to do in the world today, we start to become a really collective and cohesive community globally of women who say, we will not meddle and fight each other here at this level. This work needs to be funded abundantly, and we need to rethink how we're doing that. And it feels to me like that kind of conversation is missing because it doesn't have a place for it to happen. And I mean that both literally and metaphorically. There's no real place for those kind of interdisciplinary, large-scale conversations to happen. And I really want this centre to represent that, as well as to be bringing healing work that really works to individuals and communities all across the world.
That's wonderful. Is there anything else about the practical day-to-day, week-to-week, year-to-year work of the center that you'd want us to picture or envision?
So we are very, very new to this journey, and we're right at the beginning. And I'm convening these experts, and I intend to really glean from them what it would look like for us to do this in an entirely different way. So one of the ideas that's already come up through that process is that this is not Claire's idea of what the world should be like that I'm going to enforce on everybody, which would be a very patriarchal way of operating. But we need all the voices that we can gather to tell us what's needed, what would make a difference, what's missing, and to use that model of, as I'm talking about with this restorative justice, You put the person who was harmed at the center of the process and you say, what do you need? So for me to sit here just now and say, we're going to run programs like this and we're going to do these kinds of things and this is what's going to happen on a Tuesday, it feels not only premature, but actually counter to the model of what we're creating. And I also have huge visions for what this could represent to women globally.
What do you need most from the people listening?
Thank you. What we're looking for at this particular point in time is help with a social media campaign. We have a branding project in process, and that's going to place us very well to have really a very comprehensive social media campaign. The other thing that we're looking for at present, as with most campaigns and organizations of this nature, is seed funding that will allow us to assemble a team so that we can get very clear on what our first steps are as an organization. So we're really looking for funders to whom this mission and campaign speaks very loudly that it's the kind of thing that needs to be done in the world. And we're looking for funding that will allow us to follow this thread. So a lot of funding in the world today asks you to define what outcomes you'll have from the beginning. And that is actually going to be very difficult to do in this process. It's something in terms of funding that I've come up against personally in terms of sort of business funding, is that once you're tied into funding in a particular way for a particular activity, it leaves you unable to follow that thread of what's most alive and what's going to have the most impact. So we're really looking for funders that are going to trust in the concept of female authority from the very beginning and allow us the sovereignty that we require as an organization for the huge impact that we plan to have.
And how do people get in touch with you if they're interested in helping out?
Thank you. Our website is www.ourreclamation.org. And you can also email hello@ourreclamation.org.
Thank you for sharing about your passion and mission, Claire Standen. You can follow the campaign and support the work at ourreclamation.org or reach the team directly at hello@ourreclamation.org.
Claire's framing of restorative justice is that repair takes more than one gesture. It's ongoing work a community keeps choosing to do. We will also keep choosing to do it.
Thank you for being with us. Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.